Do you have a favorite?
Not meant to. But mostly the unloved ones, the unvisited ones, the cases that get dusty and ignored. All the broken and shunned creatures. Someone's got to care for them. Who shall it be if not us?
Yes.
Welcome to Rune Soup, a weekly podcast about magic, culture, and the very best new and old ideas for living in this world. Coming to you from 43 degrees south on a small farm in deepest Tasmania. My name is Gordon, and I shall be your host. This week, we welcome back to the show Danny Nemu. The last time Danny was on, he talked us through his personal discovery of ayahuasca and his long and ongoing experience in Santo Daime, which included, among other adventures, using ayahuasca to treat leishmaniasis whilst in the Brazilian jungle. And I asked him to come back on after seeing a video of a recent presentation he gave that was uploaded by the Breaking Convention YouTube channel. You can find it in the show notes, obviously, but basically, it is an exquisite firestorm of all the thorny topic areas we like to pick over on the show, and especially in some of the more detailed premium member exchanges. It's about which thoughts and assumptions are a perpetuation of colonial thinking and the fraught yet essential challenge of interacting and flourishing across lifeways. That's all I'll say about it for now. Because, of course, we go into it in detail in our conversation, plus you can watch it in the show notes. One last urgent legal disclaimer before we continue, however. This is a freewheeling and challenging discussion at what is essentially still day one of a new approach to medicine and healing that I think we all feel is here or coming or whatever. Neither Danny nor I are doctors or even shamans. So inevitably, we cover big health areas like pregnancy and depression and substance abuse, and not a single word of it constitutes medical advice in any jurisdiction in which you are listening to this. You know you're about to get the good stuff when it starts with a disclaimer, so let's do it. Danny, welcome back.
Thanks, Gordon. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm good. And yourself?
I'm all right, thank you.
All right indeed. So we had another email exchange recently when the presentation you gave at Breaking Convention was put up, and I found that, as ever with your stuff, quite fascinating. And I thought, well, here's a conversation I think we should have on the show. So for people who haven't seen it yet, I guess maybe we should begin by, maybe give us a description of the presentation and how you personally got started down the route of kind of examining the challenges of making truth claims across cultures, right? So on a personal level, talk about the presentation and why you gave it, if you will.
Yeah, well, okay. So the presentation was called, I think it was called Prejudice and Neocolonialism in the Academic Study of Ayahuasca. And I gave it at the Aya 2019 in Girona. So if you want to look it up online, if people want to look it up online, they'll find it in there.
It'll also be in the show notes for people listening to this, of course.
And it starts with the question, which was asked to me or asked to a group of academics who I managed to kind of weasel my way into an academics online list of basically academics talking about ayahuasca, and I ended up being the librarian of this group. And someone asked the question from outside the group, does ayahuasca cure cancer? And the academics got together and they put their heads together and they kind of decided how to respond to this question. And the way they'd respond to the question was, there is no data about ayahuasca curing cancer. There may be some anecdotal reports. So that was part of the impetus for the talk, because what does it mean? What is data? And what does it mean to say there is no data, or even worse, there are no data? And so that's kind of where the question arises from, because I've got two friends, both of whom are quite convinced that they did have terminal cancer, and now they don't. And I'll tell you the story of one of them because it's quite magical. She was in her house in England somewhere, a Japanese woman, and she had bone cancer. She had breast cancer and it had gone as far as the bone. And she had been given 18 months to live, quite some months beforehand. And so she was waiting for delivery of a compost unit, and the delivery man was walking up the path with a compost in one hand and the phone in the other. And as he was walking up the path, he phoned up someone who used to run sessions, ayahuasca sessions, daime sessions, in fact, in England back in the day. And the person who ran them wasn't there, but his wife was, and she was Japanese. And the woman who was in the house with cancer answered the door, and the guy, the delivery man, instead of handing her the compost unit, he handed her the phone. Not entirely sure how that happened. And the phone said to her, if you want to drink daime, you're going to have to stop taking pharmaceuticals for 6 weeks. That's the first thing it said. And she said to the phone, I don't know what you're talking about. I've never heard of daime, but I'm on chemotherapy and I'm dying and I'm on antidepressants and I'm still depressed. And the phone said, well, if you want to drink daime, you have to stop all that for 6 weeks. And so she did. And we're probably going back about 15 years now, and she's fine. She's much better, in fact. So that's one, what's called an anecdotal account.
And that has pure spirit logic behind it. That's a kind of classic ayahuasca move to have the person who convenes it not there, but his Japanese wife on the phone at the same time. A compost unit, that's a kind of alien logic you get with spirit access that doesn't show up in that. Yeah, life is anecdotal, and that's spirit logic.
No, you've just disqualified yourself from the academy with that kind of talk, and there begins the problem, because if you start talking like that, if I put that kind of thing into an academic paper, then it won't get through the peer review process. So, and anyone who's worked for any amount of time seriously with ayahuasca, I say seriously, they've put their heart into it. If they don't have magical things happening around them, it's because they're trying very, very hard for them not to happen. I do believe there are people who, drink ayahuasca and have a kind of therapeutic experience and maybe learn something about their relationship with their mother or whatever it might be, and off they go. That sounds a bit of a mean way to put it, but there's more to it than that. There's a whole lot more to ayahuasca, including the fact that it cures all kinds of things. In my tradition, in daime, it's considered a panacea. It's considered that it has all of the medicines of the forest wrapped up into daime. That's part of our kind of foundational legends. Yeah.
It's funny, so when you're saying about some people don't get magical effects, it's because they're trying not to. I've been thinking about how we have discussions from a specifically like healing or medical basis across cultures. And it reminds me structurally of the sort of parapsychological challenges. And what you just said there, Dean Radin's observed that there's something like 7% of people who participate in psi experiments who get like nothing, who are out, just cannot do telepathy, and like every other human can, but there's this subset that can't. And it wouldn't surprise me, again, because we don't do the research on it, if there's a subset, and it does appear to be small, of people who encounter ayahuasca who are the same, who are just like, yes, I got high and I sort of worked through some psychology stuff, but that was it. And I wonder if the numbers aren't approximately similar, because, ontologically, I think, and I'm sure you do, we're dealing with spirits here. This is an actual encounter with an entity. So it might fall into that subset. But it's an example of like we exclude ourselves from the academy, and we need not to, because that is data analysis. If we had the data, that would be a meta-analysis and a cross-comparison between psi and these sort of encounters. And I actually think the pretzel logic of spirits, we could do a paper on that as well, which is like, well, who gets pre-contact experiences with ayahuasca? And if it's a pretzel logic encounter, I think we can count that as a hit. And it's funny, like the problem isn't with science, right? Is it? It's the worldview that accompanies it that people mistake for reality.
Yeah, it depends what you mean by science. So if you're talking about what Bacon meant when he was talking about science, he was talking about tabulating data and finding patterns in it. If you talk about what Newton meant by natural philosophy, let's say, Hypotheses were not meant to be part of that process, or rather, hypotheses were there, but mechanisms, like for example, in Newton's case, there was no discovery of what was making gravity happen. There was no mechanism. There was a mathematical relationship between the positions of different planets at a certain time, and so if you start looking and inquiring too deeply into the spirits, well, for one thing, they don't seem to, I don't know if I wouldn't say they don't like it, but they certainly don't seem to play that game, or they like to play a different game, where if you kind of look at them straight on, they dodge. And I don't know, there's a certain trickster element in the spirits, certainly the spirits of ayahuasca that I've had the pleasure to encounter. So yeah, that's one part of it. I mean, just back to something you said before about those people who don't have the kind of experiences. Richard Dawkins in The God Helmet, and I think Michael Persinger himself, who invented the God Helmet. Both of those are people who, when they have transcranial magnetic stimulation, they don't get the presence of what most people get. They don't feel a presence in the room. So yeah, back to that thing about the kind of the gatekeeper keeping out paranormal experiences. So we have it on a kind of personal level as an individual who won't. Who it just won't happen to. But then we also have it as a kind of, societal sentinel or a gatekeeper that just keeps a whole lot of reality out of the academy. And, the neocolonialism part of it is, there's different ways of looking at that. But I mean, one of them is just the fact of different epistemologies, different knowledge systems, and not taking seriously what indigenous people are saying about their own spirits. But also, if you start with a word like hallucination, for example, what is ayahuasca? If you have to define something, what is it? Well, it's a hallucinogenic brew from the Amazon, etc., etc. The word hallucination means seeing something which isn't there, or hearing something which isn't there, right? And there's a lot of, let's say, forward-thinking psychologists, psychiatrists who are wanting to have these conversations, but their language is already all wrong. Even to begin with, it makes it a very difficult conversation to have. You see, when I take ayahuasca, I see things which are there.
No, exactly. And this comes back, it's weird, I'm reminded of Jeremy Nabi's description of Sa Yostra Yostra or twisted language, right? So there are ways of, dare I say, deriving data from more than human interactions that we can't get access to because of the things that we get wrong culturally speaking, things we get wrong out of the gate. And using words like hallucination is one of them, right? Because we have only one epistemology in the West, which is the sort of materialist, naturalist, capitalist one. And things only officially exist if they can be passed through that. And even with the best will in the world, and this is the bit that I get frustrated with in magic in particular, with the best will in the world and a sincere internal belief that one isn't racist or supremacist in any way, trying to say, well, that's how the Shipibo describe a tree, and it makes it, it breaks it on the way in. If you try to do cross-cultural comparison, having mistaken this epistemology for reality, then you're still doing supremacy. You're still doing imperialism. So, how do we get around that? What do you think? How do we? I don't know. Do you agree with that statement? And how do we get around it?
Well, I definitely agree with it. Jeremy Hardy put it quite interesting. He says, we don't talk to the grass, we mow it. And I guess that's another silencing of indigenous voices when we decide that what the spirits are saying is some kind of artifact of your mental derangement rather than an actual source of information. Then we're already not listening, and that's what I mean by it's all kind of neocolonialism of the astral plane. Although Jeremy Nabi himself would argue about this idea of a separation of the astral and the physical, which is another question. How do we get over it? There's a wonderful line from my tradition, which is "Ouve muito e fala pouco para conhecer os caboclos," which means listen a lot and speak a little in order to get to know the caboclos, in order to get to know the spirits. So I think it's really got to start with with that. And also, I mean, it reminds me of something that Kat Harrison said about getting to know plants generally, is that if you want to know plants, you have to know yourself, because you have to know what's speaking to you. Is it some desire that you've got? Is it something bubbling up from inside, or is it something that's coming from, I don't really want to say outside, because the ontology of the spirits is a really complicated thing to be talking about where they are, but something that's outside of your own ken, let's say, because these things are traditionally used for, I mean, these power plants, for example, are traditionally used for very specific purposes, and those purposes are divination. They're to find lost objects, they're for military divination, they're for cures. But a lot of the stuff is, particularly the kind of finding lost objects, that kind of stuff, that's very, very easily testable. Just hide some objects and then see if someone can find them when they're on ayahuasca. Not a very complicated piece of psi research to do. You don't need a big fancy machine to put your head in order to do it. But that kind of research doesn't get done. So, back to Jeremy Narby, he wanted to look into, very specifically, he wanted to find out if ayahuasca opened up some knowledge of the molecular biology of plants, which is one of the things that the shamans say it can do, in their own language. So what did he do? He took 3 molecular biologists. They were all kind of leaders in their fields. I think they were all heads of departments, and they were all having trouble in their research. So he took them off to the jungle, and he had them fed ayahuasca by a shaman. I can't remember what particular tribe of the shaman was. And all 3 of them had breakthroughs in their work, and 2 of them met plant spirits. And I think one of them became a Tai Chi teacher, and the other one divorced, and all kinds of stuff happened to them on the way back. But very, very interesting stuff. Now, no one wanted to fund that research. He had to fund it himself. He funded it with the proceeds from the American sales of The Cosmic Serpent, which is one of the best books ever. And no one wanted to publish it either. So you get like institutes like Beckley, for example, who were looking at something, I guess, similar from their own perspective. But how did they do it? They did it by, they wanted to find out if ayahuasca increases divergent thinking, increases creative thinking, let's say, which is, one way of looking at divination is a very elaborate ritual of, improving creative thinking. So what did they do? They got someone who wasn't a shaman to administer ayahuasca in a lab, and then they got people to look at sets of pictures. So, for example, an umbrella and a squirrel. And then they had to find out how many things were similar, to express how many things are similar between a squirrel and an umbrella. And that got published, and that got funded. So, it kind of raises a question of why are we asking such stupid questions? If I was a spirit, would I want to answer those questions?
Absolutely. It's the coming back to what Kat Harrison said, and also what you mentioned beforehand. Like we need to learn how to listen, and it is about who you are, but also what you are listening. That's so good, because it's what you're listening for. Because molecules are allowed to exist in this epistemology, the single epistemology we have in the West, right? Molecules are allowed to exist. So even in an attempted empirical engagement with ayahuasca, it is, well, what are the active molecules, and let's see the sort of physical effects they have on a human organism, and it's and every part of that is metaphysical in its implications, because it's not actually, as you and I know, it's not actually how ayahuasca is encountered. But a good example of this is the mice experiment. You want to tell people about that? Because I think that's just the kind of derangement that comes from a cosmology that only lets molecules exist.
And and helps mice to not exist. I think you're talking about the one about pregnancy.
Killing pregnant mice.
Yeah, exactly. So there was a question, and this is interesting. You see this a lot on nasty social media platforms like Facebook. This question arises, should pregnant women drink ayahuasca? And people who are on the surface of it extremely open to indigenous ideas and wouldn't really look like neocolonialists can get really, really head up about this. Should women drink ayahuasca? Absolutely not. No, you can't give pregnant women ayahuasca. It's a really polemic subject, right? So this was investigated by an experiment. Let's call it an experiment. And what did they do? They took a bunch of rats, a bunch of pregnant rats, and they fed these pregnant rats ayahuasca, and then they checked to see how many of the fetuses died. That was the gist of the experiment. And loads of the fetuses died. In fact, over half of the rats died, if I remember correctly. And one of the things about rats is they can't vomit, they can't puke, which makes them a pretty bad experimental subject for ayahuasca. That's one thing. Second thing is, they gave 8 times the normal dose, the normal dose of ayahuasca to a rat that can't vomit. And if you drink 8 times the daily dose of water, it will kill you. So yeah, a load of rats died. And result of this experiment, according to both the experimenter said that ayahuasca poses threats for the conceptus, poses threats for the fetus. And I think they also mentioned they said for that reason it shouldn't be given to children either, which is also another polemic subject. And that was reported in Isto Air, which is I think the second biggest magazine in Brazil, about how dangerous it was for pregnant women to drink ayahuasca. Now, if you look in my tradition, which is Daime, women in Brazil will drink ayahuasca all the way through their pregnancy. In fact, they might drink it every day during their pregnancy. And then when they give birth, on the day they give birth, they will drink it in fairly big doses. And if you look at the Shipibo tradition, for example, Shipibo shaman women, they will drink through their pregnancy. They'll conduct ceremonies during their pregnancy. And they might reduce their dose in the last trimester because it can bring on a birth. Yeah. So there is already some knowledge here, and that knowledge hasn't really been, it has been tested actually by the Brazilian government back in the day when they first banned ayahuasca. They then conducted a battery of tests, and they looked at the kind of the way that the societies organize themselves. They looked at the health. They looked at a whole load of things. And they responded by saying that ayahuasca or Daime groups and Kinga groups and UDV groups, they're really good. They said they're more law-abiding than most Brazilians, and they do all the good things that we expect that proper Brazilians should do. But they did say, we're not sure about pregnant women yet. And then about a year later, they came back and said, yeah, it poses no problem for pregnant women. So even the Brazilian government's on track about this, but it's still considered absolutely very, very naughty thing to do, as is taking SSRIs, taking antidepressants.
That experiment to me is an experiment in the hardiness of rodents rather than the impact of ayahuasca. Because as you say, like an 8 times dose to an organism that can't purge, just drown them. Just like get a hammer and smash them on the head. This isn't. Yeah, it brings up something. Well, 2 things that I want, which I know you can speak to from personal experience as well. One of the curious things that makes you realize there is something going on beyond the molecular with it in an ayahuasca encounter, particularly in a treatment sense, is that the impact of a dose varies. So you can give 8x to a rodent and just kill it, but even the ones that died may not have got high, right? Because there's something about it. You can't even. It doesn't even work on a materialist, well, if you have more of it, you will get more of an effect, is the first thing. But also it's true medicinal capacity. And it's funny, it relates to what you said about divination, right? Which is, it is one tiny part of a wider logic of healing that is just so apparent when you're like, I did the dieta thing and during my Olympia, my experience, I purged like I hadn't before in front of everyone. It was towards the end of the dieta, so people are kind of used to it and thriving in with the joy of other people's purging, which was really fun. But I got the full logic of the dieta, of being in the jungle and the dietary requirements and everything else that went with it. I had encountered kind of like a cosmic understanding of medicine that made the Western one look like the most orcish, savage thing. And you can't get that by measuring molecules, right? So like the dose dependence and wider context. You mentioned your leishmaniasis journey the first time you were on the show, but I think if we have a discussion in that context, I do believe we get closer to, a dare I say, better cosmology with which to understand healing, I guess.
And isn't it interesting that the dieta involves isolation, even if you're an indigenous person? So, we think about us moving out of our comfort zone, moving out of our normal cosmology to meet ayahuasca on its own terms. And, if you look at the traditional accounts, they will say things like, you're not allowed to wash, you have to, because ayahuasca doesn't like that kind of smell, So it's really about becoming something other than human, or, certainly something that wouldn't qualify for a very civilized human, even in a kind of indigenous society. But yeah, by stepping out of that, you can kind of look in and look at yourself from a different perspective. And I'm kind of wondering about this, because I wonder how well people get when they're not treating disease holistically.
Same. I would have thought, and it's so difficult to articulate, as I'm sure you can appreciate, but sort of post-Peru, the ayahuasca is my experience of as a spirit of it is it is the best. She's the best doctor on the planet, and she's kind of like the doctor assigned to this planet. I know that's a strange way of saying it, but her understanding, it's literally like it's not just that the spirit itself is healing, it's that she actually has almost like access to the cosmic medical library. And that was the logic I got in my dieta. And as you say, like, because we weren't allowed to wash, absolutely no chemicals. So you got given leaves and you'd wash in a waterfall every day, and you certainly couldn't use toothpaste or any of that kind of stuff. And the logic of that during my Olympia, which again isn't just a molecular encounter. I'm there with an ayahuasquero whose job it is to actually call in the spirits of healing, the other plant spirits I was working with, and ayahuasca to do the thing that I came there to do, which was heal it. I got experientially the full logic of every part of that, the isolation, and it isn't even just that ayahuasca didn't like, which is true, doesn't like those kind of chemical smells. It's that she couldn't get in. She couldn't get in to do, she's happy to do the work, but she couldn't get in unless all of that stuff was stripped away. And I don't know how you measure that by killing rodents.
Yeah, well, here's the thing. You can't measure anything in science except for one particular parameter. So a normal experiment, what will you do? You'll, like, for example, I remember back in school, if we were checking, does a plant need light? So what do? You get a couple of plants which are the same. You put them in the same temperature. You put them in a similar place. Just one of them you put in the dark, and one of them you put in the light. So you alter nothing except for one specific parameter that you're studying. Now, in my cure, I don't want to run over too much of the same ground I went over last time, but it was very, very complicated. It involved prayers. It involved a wide range of different medicines, including barks and leaves and frog medicine. It involved loads of ceremonies. It involved loads of singing, and it involved, kind of most importantly, a whole narrative that was going on inside my own head and with my body. I had an ulcer which flared up. It's called ferida brava. It means an angry ulcer, and I could almost track how well I was doing with, let's say, maintaining my dieta and also maintaining my cosmology by how it would flare up and how it would reduce. So I entered into a conversation with my disease personally, and into a conversation with the ayahuasca. Now, as you said, ayahuasca is extremely complex. It's got all kinds of things. The McKenna brothers came along with this idea, bless them, that ayahuasca is a kind of DMT administration device, and the harmine and the harmaline are there only to inhibit your enzymes so the DMT can get to your brain. Now, that doesn't tally with anything we know from the indigenous world. There are tribes where people drink ayahuasca without any chacruna, without any DMT-complaining plant in it, and it does all kinds of things. The visions might not be quite so bright and quite so exciting, but So it's become this one thing. It's become DMT, and then we crystallize it, and people smoke it, and they seem to think that that's some way related to ayahuasca. It's very, very distantly related to ayahuasca.
Yeah, we had one experience over the whole for 20 people in 5 days that was because I smoked it as well prior to this. I'd never done ayahuasca. The one thing I waited to do was this, to do it in its correct context for whatever reason. But one person had something that was, if you squinted at, looked a little bit like machine elves once in one experience. And it's not that people can do what they want. If you want to smoke DMT, go for it. That's cool. But it's
lovely.
Yeah, exactly. It's definitely, it is not a medicinal encounter with ayahuasca. It's something that's derived from it. And it's interesting because it does, to your point, that, bless them, the McKenna boys coming up with this idea, which you kind of get why they did. It was the beginning of an attempt to legitimize the discussion that hadn't been had before in the 20th century counterculture and to some extent science, although it's happening better in quote unquote science now, I guess. So you kind of get why they did it, but if you can compare the experience of smoking DMT versus ayahuasca in context, you do realize that's the best lived understanding of why their explanation is insufficient, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I would describe it maybe a little bit like the difference between a roller coaster and a bicycle. In the roller coaster, you kind of end up where you started. You might have had a very interesting time. And a bicycle, you don't go quite so fast, but you can navigate, and you end up somewhere a little bit different. But isn't it interesting, this thing about the context? I mean, you yourself, wanting to experience ayahuasca in a proper context. And there's something very strange about ayahuasca, which hasn't happened with quite a lot of other psychedelics, including most of the plant ones, is that it comes with a whole set of songs. In my tradition, it comes with a bunch of instruments and outfits and a whole kind of chronology as well. And you can drink ayahuasca outside of that context. I know people do drink ayahuasca and watch The Simpsons and stuff. But very, very few people do that. You know, quite interesting. It's almost seemed like you said it. Like you said, it's the doctor whose job it is to deal with humanity. And I wonder if, or humans. I wonder if there's a more a kind of larger, in a larger way, it's the doctor that's come to deal with humans, and it's got its own kind of agency.
Well, that's certainly my experience of it, and not just that, but which I think you kind of alluded to, although we were in different parts of what is in fact a very large continent for our experiences. The first or second night with ayahuasca, I got the sort of treatment you get if you go to the best hospital in the West, the best and most expensive hospital, because I came to her Vatican. I'm there in like Shipibo land, deep in the jungle or the forest, whatever, in a place that had been for decades allocated to kind of like the sanctity of her process. And so there was something about like, okay, you've taken me seriously. You're going to get what you came here for. And that wasn't just me. That was basically everyone on Dieta by night 2 had the experience, the healing experience, the primary healing experience that they came there to have. And I thought that, like, so there's something about how she operates that's different to, say, psilocybin, where she's clearly building an army, but like she also kind of struggles, or maybe it's just not tactically useful yet to leave her home base. So there's something about how she operates that requires sort of like ambassadors rather than migration, I guess. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's certainly, I mean, it's an interesting way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it would be that let's say, the spirits of distant places aren't really very welcoming to her. You know, they want to keep her out for reasons of their own. But yeah, who knows?
Yeah,
who knows about that? I mean, despite the legal impediments and all that kind of things, there are a stunning number of people who are drinking ayahuasca outside of the Amazon. So it is seeping through the filter in various different ways, and a lot of them have got their. I would say, you know, there's a lot of problems with the scene, but a lot of them have got their heart in the right place, I think.
Oh no, absolutely. It's almost like there's an amplitude difference there, right? So even if you're encountering it, which is, you can actually find people who are trained shamans or trained with, and are as close as we can get outside of the context to genuine ayahuasqueros outside of her traditional footprint, right? Nevertheless, there is something about I don't know, home ground advantage. There's something about being in that actual context. And it's not just because it's foreign to me. Like, my initial thought was maybe it's the exoticism of the journey across an ocean. And this is certainly part of it, but like, and you know, up into the jungle and whatever, like, sure. But as you point out, like, the same process is applied, just with, you know, truncated distances for people who are domestic to that area. So it's like, I don't know. That is another one of those things that you struggle to measure in a cosmology where you're only looking for active molecules, I guess.
Yeah, and what are these molecules anyway? I remember learning at school about what was it, the lock and key model, you know? Even I've seen some really, really interesting and kind of computer-generated graphics of all the kind of things going on DNA, strands of DNA and stuff. And these things really kind of worry me, to be honest, because it's not a lock and a key, and it's not all those kind of spheres moving around each other. It's something that is its own world, and it's a whole load of goo at a very, very micro level. And, you know, it's very difficult to talk about the very small without relating it to something that's very big, like locks and keys. Like, it's not locks and keys, is it?
Well, no, it's not. And we've had sort of, it's almost like stacking fictions, dare I say, on top of each other, because then you have, you know, superposition, which says, okay, so there are molecules, but they don't exist until I look at them. And I'm like, what are you, a toddler? This is so at its base, looking for active molecules implies something about molecules that even when we're not looking for them, they're not there, but they are. And as you say, what are they? Like, we had hooks. We didn't have lock and key when we first learned about it in school in Australia. Valence was described as kind of like Velcro hooks. And that's how you understood the different number of electrons that were attached or that could attach to a nucleus. And then at the beginning of the course, bless her, like, this is one of my favorite teachers, the science teachers, like, look, it doesn't work like this at all, but we're going to spend the next 10 weeks talking about it. What are we doing here? What's happening? And why are we using this premise as the yardstick for how we decide, or for how we validate truth, I guess?
Well, I guess if you're trying to sell a pill which has a function of working on, as a molecule, working on other molecules, well, that's why we're learning that it works in that way. You know, you can make a very cynical argument from the economics of it as to why we look at the world like that. How do you quantify something which isn't molecules? I mean, you really don't want to have to deal with infinitely complex goo.
Which is, I mean, another one for the presentation, of course, is the diphtheria story from Australia, which is not just that, but if you don't realize that's what's going on, if you don't realize that you're trying to have epistemologies interact, you end up being, well, it's Australia, so profoundly racist comes with the territory, but you end up being kind of like, if I look for molecules and don't find them, I've encountered a person who is not as good as me. I've encountered someone who is stupider or in some way inferior, and you can tip into that even for people who will swear and believe up and down they aren't racist if they're not looking at the challenges of, or if they have mistaken the colonial view for reality. They behave racistly, if you will, even if they don't think it.
Yeah, that's it. Because we live in a post-colonialist world. This is our landscape, and we can either. I mean, I was thinking about this because when I was the story from Australia you're talking about is how acupuncture was looked at in the 1870s during a diphtheria outbreak, and to cut a long story short, there was a Chinese doctor who was doing very well treating it with like firing chemicals down the throats of children with diphtheria. It was killing lots and lots of children, and he was doing very well. So what happened? People wanted to study what he did, but rather than having the practitioner administer this stuff, they got doctors to administer it, and the doctor said, no, this doesn't work. And then because people, kids were still dying, and these Chinese medics were still saving people, the public pressed further, and the package of his stuff, what was called Chinaman John's magic powder, got sent off to, which was the hospital now? Anyway, it's Dr. Blair who gave his expert technical interpretations of the facts. And he just kind of did a reductionist analysis of what all this stuff is. He said it's got musk, it's got camphor, it's got zinc sulfate. These will act as caustics and astringents. And here's a lovely line. In the hands of an ignorant man, these local applications would be productive of a grievous amount of harm, and Arsu is an ignorant pretender. So the racism is very obvious there in Dr. Blair's report, but also there's other themes there. For example, clinicians performing the trial, taking something out of its context, the reductionism of looking at a mix of powders by saying it's just camphor and potash and copper sulfate, etc., focusing on the theory rather than the results of this stuff and ignoring data, ignoring all the people who are saved by this stuff. So that is very, very much part of contemporary academic ayahuasca study. All of those things you see, you don't see them popping up. That is the general method, is to get clinicians to perform the trial, to look at it in a reductionist way, to focus on theory, to ignore all the data of my friends who reckon they've cured cancer, or me who reckon they've cured leishmaniasis. And finally, the fatal consequences of this, because Arsu, this doctor who I'm talking about in the 1870s, he got stripped of he wasn't allowed to call himself a doctor anymore. Dr. Blair berated the public and the press for believing all this nonsense, and people were dying. So what we have today in ayahuasca land is we have an epidemic of depression. So we have lots and lots of people who are depressed and who are taking, for example, SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. And we have this taboo that if you're on SSRIs, you can't drink ayahuasca, right? This is one of the things that you're not allowed to do. Now, this hasn't been studied at all. There's absolutely no data that says if you're on SSRIs, you shouldn't drink ayahuasca. There's not been a single death ever. And there are the UDV, there's a Brazilian ayahuasca religion who never believed this in the first, and have been administering doses of ayahuasca to people on SSRIs for ages. So the fatal consequences here are, people who are depressed have a much higher suicide risk. 50% of suicide victims suffer from depression, in fact. 13% of Americans are on antidepressants. So that 13% of highly vulnerable to suicide people are excluded from drinking ayahuasca, which is extremely good at treating depression, just because, what was it, in 1998, Callaway and Grob came up with a theory that ayahuasca and SSRIs could be a problematic combination. Now, in order to test that, all you do is kill some more rats, give them some ayahuasca, give them some SSRIs, and, kill some rats if that's what you want to do. But it hasn't been tested. And this is more than 20 years. This has been a dogma. It hasn't been tested.
No, and it's something my father said when I regret it now, but first time I tried to quit smoking, I went on Champix because he's a psychiatrist. And he said, listen, the side effect of smoking is death. So if you get a little bit of depression with these pills, we'll fix that too. And it's a classic psychiatric thing. But his point was, it sounds responsible to say, well, if you're on SSRIs, because I'm coming to a bigger point, if you're on SSRIs, don't take it because we don't know the risk. That's a risk reduction strategy in aggregate. It's not on a personal basis, because if you are being treated for depression, you're at a very high risk. Well, you are a much higher risk than an average person of committing suicide, which is something ayahuasca will stop. And a good example of that is, I've had this discussion with a number of people who are recovering alcoholics, a problematic term in and of itself, who are like, can I take ayahuasca? I've been sober for 15 years or whatever. And you go, well, as a matter of fact, you mentioned Gabor Mate's work in Canada as well. And it's an example of, the official statement is, no, absolutely not. You should not have any form of intoxicant because you may relapse. And the very idea that a dieta experience is anything like getting out on the terps and having fun is just madness to me or you. But you can, I think on an individual basis, you can, by the way, if you're listening to this, et cetera, but on an individual basis, you can assess and go, look, you're dealing with a worldview challenge here. So it's a question of, which thing do you think is reality? Do you honestly believe that ayahuasca as a cosmic healing spirit is going to relapse your alcoholism? And it's a question that needs to be asked on an individual basis rather than on this sort of macro risk reduction proclamation that you should never do it.
Yeah. I wonder how much of that goes back to the 12 steps.
All of it.
And AA.
All of it. Absolutely.
Okay.
Like, I this is something, because I just threw a bit of shade in my father's direction, but outside of the US, which unfortunately is a sort of minority opinion when it comes to psychiatry, the AA 12-step model is essentially there to make an industrial workforce function correctly. So it emerged out of that, like to make sure that these people that were working in these 19th century factories didn't show up hungover. And so there are some sort of structural and cosmological problems with it. Not that it doesn't work for some people, although frankly it doesn't for a lot. There are some structural cosmological problems with it, even within psychiatry, let alone elsewhere. And a lot of that comes from that deep, almost the Protestant American psyche that would do things like prohibition. And so it's the squeamishness about being anything other than Calvinist in your attitude to work. And it's mistaken for reality, and it inhibits people on an individual basis. I understand why you would do like a macro proclamation, but just as no person is like another person, not all alcoholics are the same. So, if you're 3 weeks sober, give it a bit. But if you haven't had, if you've been meditating daily and for 20 years and you haven't had a drink in 20 years and you will never have another drink and you know that in your bones, different story.
Mm. Yeah, indeed. And you get this kind of, that kind of Protestant moralistic edge. It's a really contentious subject where you bring up, when I bring up this thing about SSRIs, and I've had people argue with me, saying things like, well, isn't it better to not be on SSRIs when you drink ayahuasca? And well, that's a different question. We're not talking about physiology here. We're talking about your moral perspective on people who are on SSRIs.
Correct.
Yeah, maybe it's. I mean, I don't take them. I wouldn't take them.
No,
that's
never.
But then you've got, I remember actually after my talk in Girona, this woman who'd been desperately trying to get off SSRIs for ages in order to drink ayahuasca was there. And she, poor woman, she was suicidal and she'd been trying to get off it. And she was putting herself through this horrible process for nothing, absolutely nothing, except what? To preserve a taboo. Now, all tribes have taboos. So if we're going to analyze this from a kind of tribal perspective, yeah, it's fine. I mean, why not? Why shouldn't we have a taboo? Ayahuasca doesn't like the smell of pork according to other people's taboos. But let's look at them in terms of tribal taboos rather than dressing them up as science. And coming back to your point right at the beginning, when I was saying it depends what you mean by science. So we have a kind of what I would call scientism, which is the kind of language that you're allowed to use in reasonable public discourse. I'm not even talking about academic discourse, because if you scratch most academics, a lot of academics anyway, they have some quite wacky ideas, especially in the field, but they won't publish them in public. But then if you get into the popular kind of pop science, it becomes just the language to begin with becomes very very restrictive on what you can express, and then you open yourself up to all kinds of ridicule if you say too much that's too weird.
All of it is emanating from the failure. It's weird. It's almost medical. We can sort of argue or ping pong about with symptoms of what is in fact this baseline colonial worldview dysfunction, because that's there in, as you say, like, we'll consider the SSRI thing our version of a taboo or whatever. If you get it down to this deeper level and realize this is a game of worldviews rather than facts and things that are realities. It's whether you're looking at it from an individual basis, because it's weird. Like, obviously, again, none of this stuff is medical advice, but people like. Technically, it is better to get off SSRIs, I presume, before encountering ayahuasca. But by the same token, I know from the Johns Hopkins studies that when they were testing people with severe depression using psilocybin, they had both. And so it's sort of like, well, one thing to do if you're outside the sort of dieta no intoxicants window is to give yourself some psilocybin to fix the depression several weeks out from the dieta. Like, so there are things that on an individual basis you could do, but like, would you say that to someone who is a recovering alcoholic? At the macro level versus the individual level allows for a more interesting game, I think.
Yeah, and then if we're looking at the clash of different worldviews, And if we step back from our own and we do a kind of mental dieta, let's say, which worldview is more fun?
Yeah.
You know, who's doing better here? You know, and I think you said something very interesting. You know, it's almost medical. The word crisis is a medical term. Initially, it used to be a medical term. It was the thing which happens before you get better. And it looks like we're in a bit of a crisis here. I don't know. I don't want to be too alarmist, but we can look at this as a medical emergency that's happening to our body politic. And yeah, there's some pretty good medicine. I am worried about the medicalization of psychedelics generally, and medicalization of ayahuasca particularly. Actually, maybe I'm not even that worried. Maybe I'm more worried about MDMA, actually, because I think ayahuasca is just so resistant to medicalization. I don't know if it will work. Ayahuasca managed to resist and then co-opt Christianity, and I think it might well be able to resist and co-opt capitalism and that kind of interventionist medical model as well. Let's see. But yeah, trying to squeeze it into. I mean, some of the people who are giving talks on ayahuasca at some of these conferences, like they terrify me, and they speak with such authority as well.
Yeah, it's a really good point, because the difference being psilocybin does have less of a. Psilocybin likes to play, or the mushroom likes to play, so it seems much more amenable to being microdosed by Silicon Valley bros, which just is anathema to me. Is all kinds of reasons. It's a waste of a good opportunity to get high, for a start. But two, it's that kind of horrible bro science molecules to optimize your capitalism that you're right. Ayahuasca won't put up with that.
Yeah. I don't think. Yeah. I mean, all this talk about psilocybin, I would like to put a caveat here, which is mine. That if you're depressed, take a dose of psilocybin. Yeah, go ahead. Or take a dose of mushrooms, but make sure you do it in a clever way with someone who knows what they're doing.
Oh, sure. Yeah, absolutely. It's it can be fun to play with, but it's more fun to not play with it. It's more fun to do a decent dose.
Say, I found with mushrooms, not always. It can sometimes have a bit of a death edge to it. It seems to be quite serious in the kind of death. I don't know if it's because it grows on dead things or whatever it is, but I remember, I think the first time I took mushrooms, my friend thought he was dead and was asking me if I was dead as well. And then, I had an ex. I used to be married to someone who was kind of death obsessed and mushroom fiend. I don't know if that's your experience of it. It's not always
maybe,
playful.
But maybe I like that. Maybe I'm more goth than I think. Yeah. Yes, to some extent, it's showed me a few of those things. I think it's just, it might be because it is a saprophyte, as you say. I think also I'm with Terence on this. I think it came from space. I think it's actually profoundly fucking old. And as a result, it's kind of different. It's less interested in the outcome of humanity. Not that ayahuasca cares, but like she is like a nurse, and psilocybin is kind of like Terence, really. Like, it's here for fun and showing off and whatever, and I think that's why it can kind of work in a bro science microdose sense. But I know what you mean. I guess I'm concerned. Here's the thing: if there's a tactical play that can happen, if at least DMT, if not ayahuasca, in some bastardized form, is allowed to have therapeutic legitimacy, in the same way we're sort of seeing the first few stones that start the avalanche for psilocybin in the United States from a mushroom legalization perspective, it will allow for the kind of, hopefully, this is the glass half full, decentral flourishing of legitimate ayahuasca encounters as well. Like, even they might be called recreational, I would call them legitimate, but we might hope. I think that'll happen with mushrooms, as it's sort of happened with weed. That you can still use it medically, but and you can use it medically outside the medical establishment. It's just that it's called recreation.
Yeah. I get where you're coming from. There's a complexity here, which Hakim Bey sums up by saying, "Not peace, but a sword."
Sure.
Another way of looking at it is, if you're going to sup with the devil, sup with a long spoon. Definitely politically, it does kind of make sense to follow the medical route. I remember Ben Sessa who's also a Psychedelic Press author, with who I sometimes have disagreements. His kind of take was, look, this is what's happening. Get on, if it's going to happen, it's going to happen via mainstreaming and medicalization. Get on board, almost like the kind of ultimatum. And it does feel like a little bit of a threat to those of us who are a little bit weirder or a little bit more indigenously interested or whatever it might be. It feels like there's all this money going in a certain direction and there's all this power and capital going in a certain direction.
I guess because I'm certainly much more on your side of these things than Ben's, is two things are happening, which is there's a Trojan horse component if we're going to, talk strategy to it. The sort of giving things like the mushroom and ayahuasca therapeutic legitimacy sounds all well and good for the materialists, but they've caught a whale. The thing that they're bringing in isn't just molecules. These are actually like deeply ancient spirits, and so there's sort of a dual thing. I absolutely hear what you're saying, which is let them go down that route and think they're doing that, because at the same time, and I was having this conversation with a guest for next week's show. The discourse in the public has moved from presumptive materialism to the point that if you espouse materialism now, it's kind of like it jars, like someone's being casually racist. And I mean, even like in deep Guardianista land in Islington, like it's not even, it's like, what? Because it's almost like the imperial assumptions of materialism are getting closer to the surface. So I kind of think two things are going on, which is that sort of emergence of Fort's dominant of wider inclusions is happening at the same time and is co-implicated in the therapeutic legitimacy of these spirits. So I guess I'm kind of all in on it, because I don't think materialism survives legitimizing something like ayahuasca. So it's sort of like a trick. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's a really interesting way of looking at it. And because what I was thinking when you were talking about the whale, I was thinking, can the tower contain the whale? And I think, it seems that the tower is kind of crumbling anyway. And by that, I'm talking about, like, for example, the editor of The Lancet came out saying, a lot of our science is simply untrue, maybe half. This is The Lancet's a major medical journal. We had a couple of years ago an attempted replication of 100 studies in psychology. I think about a third of them, they managed to replicate them. There's been a lot of analysis into stuff that's published in journals. There have been people who've submitted just complete nonsense articles which have been published in journals, and they've done it to say, look, what's going on here with the whole peer review process. It seems like this scientism is on it's wounded. I don't know if it's mortally wounded, but it's wounded and it's leaking blood. And the reaction to that can be anything from a more open-eyed perspective on indigenous science to raging kind of flat earthers, cathar Jew, conspiracy theory spouting nutcases, because we don't have an authority to return to if the scientists themselves are losing faith in their own science. And our tendency is to run back to daddy, when we don't know what to do. But what if there's no daddy to run back to? Then what do you run to your own experience, and that's in a way is even more scary. So we're in a quite a dangerous situation now.
Yeah, I think the difference in between science and scientism, and this actually sort of neatly brings it back full circle to the opening anecdote of your friend who 15 or so years ago cured her cancer with ayahuasca through and the appearance of spirit logic. Now, when I have Dr. Kreipel or Dr. Radin on the show, one of the big challenges in parapsychology is the fact that there is no life in a lab situation that allows for what's clearly going on there to happen. So, for instance, you can't replicate. It just so happened that a Japanese woman was on the phone, and the phone was accidentally given to another Japanese woman who was dying of cancer, and the phone said something about daime. Like, you can't replicate that in a lab. Yeah, and this is what parapsychology sort of realized over the last several decades is the big parapsychological events happen outside of looking at xenocards, right? Because it's not you see the limitations of the worldview. Now, weirdly, I think science needs to get rid of words like anecdotal and realize that there is, in fact, and we have the technological capacity for it, to start doing aggregate or meta-analysis of anecdotes. Because, I mean, the end of your leishmaniasis story, which I remember from last time and is in the presentation for people watching in the show notes, is that your twins had birthmarks where your initial leishmaniasis wound was. And this is long after you'd cured it, right? So, well, after you'd cured it anyway.
Yeah.
That's spirit logic. Yeah. So if we add together, especially as there are more and more encounters with these things, if we add together the thousands of them, the scientists, in fact, do have something to science up that doesn't end in sort of molecules and imperialism.
Yeah, and all the hypotheses are already there as well, because that experience I had of the scar being passed on to my kids, or let's not be causal about this, my kids having scars in the same place that I did, that's very common in the jungle. So you could go into the jungle and you can ask, well, what kind of weird stuff do we expect? And then you can go and look for it. You don't have to invent the wheel. And you're right, we do have artificial intelligence, for example, which can analyze themes in trip reports, for example. So but moving towards the qualitative and away from quantitative, and then we're moving back into this idea of significance, which was kind of where I started my talk. It was on that point. It was about, I thought it was significant that both of my children were born with scars where I had my scar. But significance in science is P equals 0.05. That's what significance is. So if your only significance that means anything to you, and that meaning is mathematical, what kind of a world do you live in? I mean, what kind of poverty are you living under if that's what meaning is? Some computer science analyzing other people's experience and that becoming significant for you.
Yeah. The skin crawls. It's weird. Like, so you could do, if they still wanted to measure stuff, what I find so fascinating about spirit encounters of personal significance is you could actually assign a p-value to the fact that your kid showed up with scars where you had your scar, right? And you could say this is like P8. This is so weird. So you actually could, let's say you have a few thousand purported spirit encounter anecdotes you could sort of rank them or categorize them by the actual person's allocation of significance. And because it hides, one of the things that I find fascinating about dream encounters and all the rest of it is when you try to tell someone something that you know is profound, like it's between you and the universe, right? Insofar as those things are different, it sounds crap. It sounds so small and pointless. Like describing a dream, it's like I was in a house, but it wasn't my house, and my grandfather was there, but he was dead, and he was trying to do this, and it just sounds like shit. But as you encountered it, that it was real, and not real, profound, like P8, not P.5 or whatever. And that this is what I mean. I'm glass half full about what science can do in our emerging world, because there are still things to count. It's just they're counting the wrong things.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, this brings up something that Crowley says. He's talking about attaining to the sphere of or the rank of Magister Templi, and the task there is to interpret every experience that you have as a kind of direct communication between the gods and yourself. And what happens to him is very interesting. He noticed he has a change of fortune, a very large change of fortune every so often. And he looks back in his diaries and he realizes that it's every 73 days. I think it's 73. It's either 72 or 73. And he also realizes that number is the Kabbalistic number of Chokmah, which is the next sphere which he's attaining to. So he starts calling these cycles days of Chokmah. He says during this period when he's going through this particular initiation, something quite funny. He says that the people who appeared to him, and he actually says, trite as this may appear, and he's saying this looks ridiculous, but what happened was the people he was hanging out with started to assume the aspects of animals. and he talks about the camel, and he talks about a cat, and I think he talks about the snake, and having these kind of mythological, these myths playing out in his life, and he relates it to the passage of the dead in the Egyptian Book of the Dead, meeting all these kind of half animal, half god, half humanoid gods, and then he says once he's attained to that grade, then they all stop having that kind of significance, and the camel doesn't really look that much like a camel anymore. But in the particular narrative of what he's going through, it's profoundly significant, more significant than anything. And you get that as well with good psychedelics, where everything comes together. And I'm talking about bringing in the context, and even kind of warping the context in the very strange way that psychedelics do. It's extremely significant, but it's personally significant. And you try and explain it to someone, becomes quite difficult, which is perhaps one of the reasons why, certainly in my tradition, we don't share our vision. Our masters keep very quiet about what they've seen, because how can you explain a vision and what it means to you? The meaning may change, the meaning may unfold. Who knows? But but in a way to keep it from becoming banal. You know what I mean?
I think that's honestly.
I'm not saying that's.
Yeah. I think that's honestly a big factor of it. So my experience of that is almost like, and I always use diving descriptions, right? But it feels like bringing artifacts up from a shipwreck, and as you sort of expose them to oxygen, they sort of crumble. It feels like the objects belong under the water, and if you that's the kind of metaphor I use when describing the risks of doing this cross-cultural epistemological dance. Because if you haven't done the decolonializing of your self-work and your worldview before you start genuinely wishing to be intellectually and culturally enriched by the understandings of other cultures, if you try to bring in that into, and you might, with the best will in the world, you'll just turn it into rust as you try to port it into a worldview you don't even realize that you're taking with you. And I like the Crowley thing is so cool. Like if you throw some phenomenology brackets around what he's saying, you can kind of squint down and have it bear, and I don't want to overstate this, but I also don't want to understate it, bear structural similarity to broadly speaking, shamanic cultures. And it's especially as you can see that the things that obsessed him, which is the 19th century and early 20th century non-Jewish understanding of Kabbalah and the 19th century understanding of Egyptology. And I say both of those things with love and respect. But if you kind of look at that and see this is his frameworks for interpreting a real thing that's going on, and to say that without implying any kind of, or to say that with the awareness that to say that is making a structural claim about reality, but you still see that experientially he had a real encounter. He had a real encounter that you can, if you're sensitive about it and don't read too much into it, you can put next to other encounters. And this is the beginning, I think, of what I'm saying. Like there will be things to count. There will be things to count in Jack Hunter's Dominant of Witchcraft.
Well, there's another guy who was excluded from the academy in a rather brutal way, and I talk about him in the talk that you mentioned. There was a guy who argued about or brought up evidence about the ontological reality of spirits, and in a book called something along the lines of what was it called? The Supernatural in History and Culture. I think that's what it's called. The Supernatural in History, Society and Culture. This is why his chapter was rejected. I'm going to quote it here. Although there were no major stated objections to the actual content of what you wrote, your status as a scholar should be called into question because of publications and associations in which you present information that supports claims the ontological reality of supernatural phenomena. So, I mean, those editors, well, I imagine they're not racist. I'm sure they're quite nice to brown people. But what they're doing there is they're excluding someone because he has argued for the reality of something that lots and lots of people, lots and lots of brown people in the global south believe.
Yeah. they're nice to brown people because they think they're intellectual children, and not just brown people. Southern Italians, you don't even need to get that brown. But it is like they are racist. That is a racist statement, and it's a weird. It's being quite good at racism because they are being racist at the global South via attacking like a white Englishman. That's 3-pointer racism there.
Well, yeah, maybe you could more charitably say that they're people of their time. The way that we talk about Churchill as a man of his time.
But that's true.
Maybe...
And the weird thing is, this is a really good example. The people who have statements like that, they jar to the rest of us now. And I don't just mean listeners to the show. Obviously, it will jar with them. But a statement like that is like, what decade do you think? What have I traveled through time? Am I still high? Is this, is this actually like 1888? What the hell's happened? And it's and I think those statements jar, and I think we kind of feel that. We feel that in culture, or if you're somewhere and someone makes some sort of grandiose and outdated materialist claim, as if they're wearing some sort of waistcoat and being a dick at Paddington Station.
Indeed, yeah. So that was 2017, and that is a man in power. I think Jack Hunter tends to wear the waistcoats, no?
Yeah, that's true. All right. Well, this has been great. I got a lot off my chest. It's funny, like you listen to different shows, and you go, I need to find venues to have this discussion, and then I see your presentation. And I'm like, I feel like Danny's in a similar boat. I feel like he needs to have venues to have these kind of discussions.
Always good for the opportunity to purge.
No, absolutely, and. Bless it. And speaking of, no, I can't get that to work. Speaking of purging, speaking of taking 8 times the recommended dose, that sort of works. Where do people go to find out more about you and other works you've got and that kind of thing?
Okay, so maybe Twitter is a good place to start, which is at Rev Nemu. Then I've got a website which is nemusend.co.uk. It's a little bit neglected. The best place to read my stuff is by buying my second book, Neuroapocalypse, is available through Amazon, and it's coming up to Christmas, and all your friends will like it. That would be one thing. Go and check out the reviews; they're all really good. And then I've got my first book, which is being republished, the new edition that's happening in December, just before Writers on Drugs. So there is a London event where the Psychedelic Press authors are getting together. It is on the 8th of December, and at the moment you've got early bird tickets. I think they're going until October the 31st. So London people, come along to that. That's going to be really good. It's at Regent University, London. So you can check me out there. I'll be talking about racism and neocolonialism. Last time we did that, I talked about drugs in the Bible. So there's loads. What else? If you want to get an academic article out of me, there's one on drugs in the Bible. It's called Getting High with the Most High. All of that kind of jazz. Where else to look? And there's a whole bunch of podcasts, including the last one I did on Rune Soup, which I really enjoyed. And I just want to give a shout out to one more project which I'm doing. Keep this to yourself. Listeners, don't tell anybody. But there's an organization which is called RAIN, and that means Regenerative Agroforestry Impact Network. And the website is rainumbrella.org. And what we're doing is reforestation in Brazil. It seems to be one of the things that happens to a lot of ayahuasqueros when they get a little bit over their heads as they start trying to plant trees. So we're partnering with rural communities, building sapling nurseries in schools, which are capable of producing 1,500 trees a year, and then reforesting waterways, degraded springs and dried up springs and riverbanks and all that kind of jazz. So if you like trees, then have a look at that. And if you've got any money, then feel free to send some money our way or go into trees, basically.
Amazing. And that will, of course, be in the show notes as well. Thank you very much for co-facilitating this rant. I found it very
That was marvellous.
purgative. Yeah. And
you know what, Jordan? I've just thought of one thing I did want to say, which I forgot to say. There's a particular researcher who I'd like to bring people's attention to because he's a psychiatrist and he's fantastic. He's called Simon Ruffle. And he's conducting some research on ayahuasca. And the first thing he did was he put together a squad of indigenous people in order to oversee the research that's going on. It's with, I can't remember which institute it's with, but it's very much mainstream psychiatric science, but it's been doing with the oversight of indigenous people. So, we've made we've given a lot of time to dissing scientists in the show, and I'd like to just bring up that guy's name. His name's Simon Ruffle, and he's doing some really, really interesting stuff.
Awesome. Well, once again, thank you so much, and thanks for bearing with the inevitable technical challenges we had at the beginning, and always a good time.
Yeah, thanks very much, Gordon.
Good stuff as ever. Be sure to check out the show notes for that presentation, as well as links to some of Danny's other stuff, of course. And these subjects are top of mind. I mean, they usually are, but they're top of mind at the moment for me because I've just put the finishing touches on the structure of a 3-day workshop I'll be co-convening with Marcus Matafero-Lloyd in New Zealand in February next year. And as you probably know, one of my perennial bugbears is, in Magic Land, most animism talk is ontological. And frankly, even that is being too charitable. Most animism talk is religious talk. The upshot of that is that people are generally having a religious opinion about a neocolonial epistemology rather than actually validating truth from inside an animist one. Now, if that sounds like splitting hairs, it isn't. And there's a whole bunch of material in the premium members area that can break you out of that state of imperial capture, if you will, and if you're keen for it. But let me give you a very good example, I think. How we perform a group of behaviors that you could previously classify as conservation without using that word, because that word implies there is some kind of pristine and untouched nature that we can somehow get back to. And it is also some kind of like delicate white woman that needs protection, right? And this pristine or untouched nature has been sullied by humans who are separate to the word nature. And frankly, if you don't know the history of the conservation movement, that's it, plus racism. And that's a live example because you may recall from when he was on the show, Marcus is restoring his ancient or ancestral past site. And plus, during the workshop, we'll be exploring approaches to non-endemic species and reforestation and what they look like, all these behaviors, when they emerge from a multi-species responsibility rather than the idea that somewhere around 1850 nature perfected itself and we have to get back to it. So it's sort of like what these behaviors look like when they emerge from the reality of a living universe rather than you, the royal you, saying I'm religiously animist and therefore I'm pro-dolphin conservation, right? Like, of course, you don't want dolphins to be killed, but you understand the difference there where one worldview is trying to turn the entire planet into a cosmic Victorian zoo, and the other one is looking at how, where we are, from a flow model, we head towards this multi-species responsibility and mutual flourishing. And that's the difference. That's what I mean by most animism talk is at best ontological, if I'm being charitable, and otherwise religious. And instead, what we're looking at is how it emerges from a decolonized method of truth validation. And that's kind of why when I saw Danny's presentation, I'm like, yes, this is a show we need to have. And so we did. And that was this week's show. Be sure to subscribe and share and all that stuff. And as usual, find us online at runesoup.com or the RuneSoup Facebook page, and find me on Twitter where I am Gordon, Gordon_White, WHITE. Until next time.